Well, first of all, I wanted to thank also Alana Lockward for giving me the opportunity to present some work I did a few years ago. It's going to be a cultural, historical little case study. I'd like to start with a snippet from an autobiography, which is a notoriously unreliable sort of historical evidence. Reflecting on her years in Munich in the late 60s and early 70s, Donna Summer, the African-American singer, actress, and model, exuded enthusiasm. I was in the right place at the right time. Now, why would that be the case? Summer and her ghostwriter make sense of her German experience, which she was living there for quite a few years, by explaining to their international audience, I quote, "Liberal post-war generation Germans living in Munich wanted to make some personal kind of statement about the civil rights movement in America. Frequently, that statement took the form of friendship, support, and work for anyone of color who happened to be from the States." I mentioned this autobiographical snippet because I think it brings out quite a few contradictions of that moment. Of course, we may wonder what did she mean by anyone of color who happened to be from the States? What kind of audience is she intending? There's a long tradition of US African Americans using their experience in Germany, where there was a lot of racism, as everybody knows, but in order to speak to a US American audience and say, well, things are better in Europe, when in reality that might not be the case, but polemically it might be. So I think she stepped right into the contradictions of that moment of cultural and political upheaval of around 1968 in its local German versions. Questions of exoticism, of the kind of projections that Gada Kilomba talked about earlier, and that type of racism, of guilt, of otherness, and of what Deleuze and Guattari call becoming minor. I think all of that contributed significantly to that historical moment in Germany and often isn't seen. I think that straightforward anti-black racism remained a stark reality in large parts of German society and still does. Gestures of appreciation, as mentioned by Summer, also reached beyond merely a few urban bohemian circles. In West German culture in the late 1960s and in the early 70s, I think that there was something what I would call Afro-Americanophilia, that is affirmative or even worshipful approaches to and appropriations of US African-American culture and politics, which often, not always, included a desire for African-American people. Now, the term isn't meant to describe the attitude of a society in its entirety, as I said, far from it, but some important subcurrents within it and a specific cultural theme. In a text from 1994, the British cultural critic Corinna Mercer, who was quoted earlier today, also wrote that around 1968 in the US and in the UK, many white rebels apparently wished to become black in their imaginary. And when he wrote that, I think that he could have extended this analysis to the German context, because we can find quite a few sources that confirm that. Finding examples for what I call Afro-Americanophilia at the time certainly isn't difficult. Sociocultural analyses, such as Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, were reviewed enthusiastically among West German intellectuals. They sort of embodied a global sense of now. I think a good anecdote for that is that when a lifestyle magazine, Twen, presented the ideal apartment of 1969, that was the book that was lying on the desk. Soul music, which is about African-American experience and largely presented as an irreducibly black form of popular musical expression, succeeded commercially and found its way into the minds and movements of millions worldwide, including in Germany. The slogans and gestures of the Black Power movement found imitators in demonstrations where thousands of mostly, or very, very much mostly white Germans were heard chanting, "We are all black" in English as a gesture of solidarity. But also in nightlife, where people try to sort of copy handshakes and things like that. Voluminous hairstyles were not more really referred to as Lockenkopf, but as Afro-Frisuren among white people. A radical left-wing author from Berlin, taking up a popular trope, termed his home district, Kreuzberg, where we are, West-Berlin's Harlem, the Harlem of West-Berlin, and he and his circle referred to themselves as, quote, white N-word in the American sense. Magazines printed more or less explicit depictions of interracial sex and reflected on its significance. In urban gay subcultures too, blacks were particularly desired sex partners, as Lothar Lambert's 1975 underground film One Berlin Harlem shows. Advertisers began to use black models, mostly women, in highly sexual and sometimes quite primitivist frameworks, including also Donna Summer, who I mentioned earlier. She worked as a model for AfricOvenir, which was sort of the most famous campaign in that sense in Germany. At the same time, some radical left student groups, in their attempts at anti-war organizing among GIs from the United States, exclusively approached African-American soldiers. On the other hand, theorists like Jürgen Habermas, in quite a different tone, warned white German students not to, as he said, overly identify with oppressed groups abroad, such as peasants in Vietnam or, quote, Negroes in urban slums in America. And it was apparent that he considered that a widespread issue, a widespread problem. Now these are some images here. I'll get to a few of them. I think what I want to point out was that this crosses a variety of cultural fields or spheres: pop music, radical politics, sexuality, consumer culture, and mostly countercultural or underground scenes. I think there's a common pattern among that, despite apparent tensions. And I think for the purpose of analysis, we could say that the time from 1967 to maybe 72 or 75 are a very similar moment. So I want to present this, this sort of historical research. Well, I thought earlier this morning about all the great work that was presented here on decolonizing and on Black Europe. And I was thinking, well, what I'm doing here is quite frivolous in a way. It's a very sort of very specific topic, and kind of I wonder how it fit in. But I think this is a part of writing a story of whiteness in Germany and going beyond whiteness in Germany, which might help add to the discussion that are being had here. So I will do that in. And these are, so basically this is, I'll just leave this the book cover. Then Concrete is a sort of a mixture between a radical left and a soft porn magazine, which at that time, which used printed parts of the book, but then also had sort of a soft porn images with it. The third image is you see the Black Panther, as from the West Berlin radical magazine Agit 883, which is the first manifesto of the Red Army faction, where they used the Black Panther as a symbol, and they've written about that, quite a few of them before. The other one I will get to. The one on the bottom is from Trikont Verlag in Munich, which published quite a few writings, mostly from the Black Panther Party, and the other one I'll get to as well. So I'll briefly talk about about two historical focuses. The first, which sort of situate the New Left in Germany in the context of how it responded to the Black Power movement, or some people within it responded. So on a political level, in the late 60s, many people and some organized groups in West Germany wanted to support the contemporary freedom movement, decolonization, and African-American freedom movement. On the German side, this included the Black Panther Solidarity Committees, on the one hand, and then groups within the so-called GI underground, which partly overlapped, and later on the Angela Davis Solidarity Network. I won't go into great detail here. Most of these groups came from the anti-imperialist radical left scene of the student rebellion. They weren't particularly large, but they were very visible, and they included leaders and protagonists of later developments, quite prominently Kadi Wolf, the head of the Frankfurt chapter of the Sozialistischer Deutscher Studentenbund, who had been an exchange student in Michigan, and then founded a Black Panther Solidarity group in Frankfurt. And it's kind of interesting to see that I think a generation of German politicians who came to power with the red-green government were socialized also in the context of that stuff, with all its ambivalences. And of course, many more people attended demonstrations and conferences and speeches featuring Black Panther Party representatives and others. Oh, ouch, okay. So, I think just a few things to mention. I think it's important that for the West German left, their American and German opponents were closely intertwined, but not identical. the German government, West German government, was allied with the United States, and the country was a staging ground for the American military and its war in Southeast Asia. And exposing and incriminating the deep-seated racism of the US represented the main concern of these groups. For them, a commitment to what they considered anti-racism was a crucial lesson taken from National Socialism, however little experience they themselves might have had with that form of oppression. So on that strategic level, of course, there was also the idea of creating a second front within the capitalist metropoles. And in some cases, it must be said that this solidarity work produced tangible results. Cooperation between US African-American GIs in Germany, underground activists and visiting students from the US, and from various African countries, and predominantly white German supporters, particularly in the Frankfurt area, had a significant impact on the treatment of black soldiers in the US military, because they were, the government was forced to create new rules in order not to be able to be shamed with the racism charge in this country. So that's sort of the official level of political discourse and strategy. Other activists wanted to translate the tactics and images into their own context, those from the Black Power movement, into their own context in more immediate ways. In particular, this was true for the so-called Blues in West Berlin, which was less a formally organized group than a countercultural urban scene. Within the field of the German New Left, they stood out by virtue of the simultaneity and radicalism of their political and cultural opposition to mainstream society, by trying in their own way to collapse the political and cultural sphere. I think they must be understood in relation to the development within the United States, where despite the Black Power movement's strategies of black self-reliance and self-empowerment, some predominantly white group within the so-called underground modeled themselves after the most radical parts of the Black Power movement. We saw a little bit of that in the snippet by Adler's film yesterday, where I think it was somebody from the Weather Underground who was shown with the up against the wall slogan. And I think the West Berlin people modeled themselves after those people very much. I'm almost out of time, but just a few things. The so-called Bewegung 2. Juni, which is a sort of an urban guerrilla group from West Germany, grew out of the Berlin blues scene. It was responsible for several bombings and also murder. The blues, I think it's interesting to look at when you look at their materials. They have on a prominent place an R. Crumb comic from the 1960s of a black man playing piano, blues piano. And that was that filtered through the US white underground, seeing the image of African American culture is what motivated many of them. I think what's important there, for instance, is that, again, this is sort of typical from the literature in the Afra, which is an underground magazine for different parts of the Berlin scene, but that's sort of the rhetoric that comes out of the Berlin blues. You have the Free Huey, or the various sort of slogans from the Black Panther Party movement, and of course the pig is taken from Emery Elliott's illustration. Oh, sorry, yeah. Emery Douglas's illustration is being sort of copied and pasted into the literature here, and the Staatsanwalt Krause becomes the Oberpig. The verbal register was complemented by the physical, bearing, posture, styles of walking, reflected the African American influences which the scene's name so prominently displayed. One activist, for example, remembers using the Black Panther salute whenever he would see a black person in Berlin. They spoke of the man in German and in quite a few other words. Intellectually, connections between one's own position and African American experiences were made by means of parallels and analogies. Infamously, the Jerry Rubin, the US yippie prankster, had claimed that his long hair was like dark skin. And people in the West German scene too insisted that they experienced discrimination and were being treated like black people because of their long hair and hippie looks. They got kicked out of bars, were spat upon in the streets, employers discriminated against them. Of course, the distinction between a racially ascribed and colonial hierarchy and a self-chosen attribute like long hair is obvious. But this conflation of those very different things provided a subjective basis for claiming a perspective out of oppression. Now, all of this is very problematic, but the point is that these were the people who thought most about what anti-racism might mean, what anti-imperialism might mean, and who, in what they did, much of it sort of from the Bildungsweite Uni, I don't want to have a firm position on the judge entirely, but in terms of the anti-racism and the idea of going beyond the white subjectivity that they were socialized into. Well, we can criticize it very much, but we must also see that this is where most movement was taking place. So the people with the most problematic statements, in a way, were the ones also who were most productive in some ways, as I spoke in terms of the solidarity, but people helped African-American GIs who deserted the army to get to Denmark or to Sweden, and other things like that. Okay, I think I'm pretty much out of time. So.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's